Thanks for allowing us this opportunity to get together and just have a conversation. I think it's something that we need to discuss, because if you look at this room, everyone in here has a traditional view of America. You're of an age group and a generation just like me and my wife, but a little different than my daughter who's standing there with that fancy tablet in the back of the room. She and her husband live in Bend. Diane and I have lived in Klamath County for about 18 years. And I don't want to scare you all, but we have been off the grid for 18 years. In other words, I haven't got an electric bill at my house for 18 years. Cool. And I use solar energy to do it. I had to replace it at the 12-year mark, and then it only lasts for 20. And then I bought a new system. I've been on the new system for about 6 years or so, and it is fabulous. Every piece of toast, every pot of coffee comes from solar energy. Don't let stories like this convince you that solar energy is renewable energy and that solar energy is sustainable energy. If you know anything about this area, if you lived here more than 24 hours, you'll recognize every stinking night the sun goes down. Okay? Lo and behold, all of the capital and infrastructure that gets invested in solar energy goes idle for 2/3 of every single day. In North America, there's only 5 hours of solar day in North America. Even at the equator, there's only the equivalent of 8 hours. So even the best installation that you can do only generates electricity for 8 hours out of a 24-hour period. It's enormously capital expensive and intensive, although anybody can set it up. Look at me. Anybody can set it up after you get it in. There's a philosophy going on here, and I want to point this out with this slide. We went to the musical of Les Miserables, when it came out back in February or March, whatever time frame that was, and I reread the book. It's a monster book to read. Has anybody read it? A handful. In there, there's this sentence, and I thought this sentence was profound. This is something that somebody noticed and we have lost in our generation. Look at what it says here. Man is not a circle with a single focus. He's more like an ellipse. There are 2 focal points, right? There's 2 portions of our lives here on earth. One is formed with ideas. The other is formed with facts. Let's look at a few of these facts. Gary's going to be talking about the KBRA more with scientific detail. I'm going to be thinking more about the ideology. Think about this fact. We are all familiar with the Earth is 75% water. Who thinks that? Go ahead, raise your hand. Nobody? It's a giant blue marble. Look at this beauty. 75% of the Earth's surface is water. But here's the real details. All of the water on the planet is represented by that single large bubble. It's about 800 miles in diameter, and that's all water, all salt water, all fresh water, all water in the atmosphere, and all water in the glaciers. All water. The freshwater bubble is that other little teeny bubble. It's about 169 miles in diameter. That's fresh water on land and the atmosphere. That includes atmospheric water. That includes glacier water, river water, lakes and streams, but that's fresh water. Look at this slide. See that little teeny little blue speck? You feel like you've got a bug in your eye? That blue speck is only 35 miles in diameter, and that is fresh water in stored lakes and streams. There is very little water available from a freshwater source on planet Earth, and tell me what happens when you allow that water to flow into the salty Pacific. Go ahead and tell me. What's the end of the game after you let that water flow into the salty Pacific? What's left for humankind? You lose it, and it's gone for good. So the KBRA has 3 focal points. One is fish. The second one is the environmental water account, which includes underground storage, aquifers. It includes refuges. It's not downstream flow, but it is environmental flow. And the last item is agriculture for man to use to grow food for our population. In the biological opinion, there is this sentence. This comes out of paragraph 4.2. I trim the sentence. These are long-winded guys, and they say this. The water for agriculture, this is in section 4.2 of the biological opinion, water for agriculture is subject to, 1, water availability. Well, if you spill it into the salty Pacific, oops, there goes that game. While maintaining lake hydrology, well, there's an interesting item because now that's a focal point for maintaining lake hydrology without avoiding or jeopardizing the existence of endangered species. So look at the language embedded in this and then try and answer this question. We started with that quote from Victor Hugo. And he says we've got ideas and we've got facts. In this paragraph, help me, or can you, or can I, identify what the facts are and what the ideas are. Where is the ideology coming out of this paragraph?
It's all ideas.
It's goals, it's objectives, it's strategies. These are not scientific facts. These are ideas. These are things we're trying to achieve. This is an area where we're trying to take this precious water, and we've made a decision about where it should go, primarily to fish, secondarily to the environmental water account, and thirdly to agriculture only after we maintain the hydraulic conditions that exist in the rivers and lakes, and we make sure we avoid jeopardizing any other of the species that exist within the Klamath River Basin. This is not science. This is ideology. Here's another example of ideology. Hydropower facilities in Oregon, in operation in Oregon, prior to 1995, are not renewable energy. Atmosphere, rain, snowpack, river flow, power from a turbine, and that happens every season, every year, for endless eternity, and somebody had the gall to say this is not renewable energy. You've got to be familiar. Greg Smith just put a citizen petition on the street. He was the first signature. He needs 83,000 signatures to make that petition on the ballot measure, which basically negates this and makes hydroelectric power, regardless of when it was run, it makes hydroelectric power a viable renewable energy resource. The reason is that in 1908, this hydroelectric facility was built on the Klamath River system in 1908. Do the math for me. In 1908, it's been running 365 days a year, 24/7, every hour of every day, and it's been generating electricity for 400 homes. Remember, I told you when we started, I replaced my solar array after how many years?
12.
12 years. This has been running for how many years? And this becomes another ideological dilemma that we face. We have to think in terms of fact and fiction, between science and ideology, because there are ideas out there that are actually detrimental to our well-being. Think about the ideology. I don't think PM 2.5 is very bad here in Jackson County. Klamath County and Lake County suffer from the PM 2.5. Are you familiar? Anybody familiar with PM 2.5? PM 2.5 in our area, PM is particulate matter. You've probably heard of, in agriculture, of fugitive particulate matter coming off of a tractor. That would be dust, right? And that has been regulated by the EPA. So this PM 2.5 scenario that we see here, this is a graph. This comes from the book The Skeptical Environmentalist. And this is a graphic. Of course, nobody was actually recording PM 2.5 data back in the 15, 16, and 1700s. But this is an estimate based on the forestry that was consumed to generate all of the power and fire and steam energy, as well as just to keep those old castles warm in the dead of the cold and foggy morning in London. So, but look at this. In the Clean Air Act of 1970, they came to the game and the story was already over, right? Tell me, if you can, what caused this enormous decrease in air pollution and increase in clean air technology?
Electricity.
Well, electricity is part of it, but the key is prosperity. The key is man's ingenuity, man's invention, the marketplace, and prosperity generated enough capital resources to invest in cleaning up the air. The track that the EPA is on, the track that the Klamath River is taking under the KBRA and KHSA, will destroy prosperity for this community. It will destroy prosperity for our community, and the end result will be a worsening of the environment around us, because we won't have the capital resources, we won't have the discretionary income, we won't have the ability to combat any problems that we do have within the environment. And that's really the way we're going. There's another ideological problem here with the PM 2.5. It's sort of difficult to see, but there's a red dot in here, kind of under the word Oregon. That red dot is the Klamath Air Quality District. All of the smoke you see pouring out of the Berry Point fire went into California and into the city, Merrill, Malin, and those areas in southern Oregon. It actually did come into the Tule Lake and into Weed and those kinds of areas. You can kind of see it flowing down across the map. None of that was a problem for the PM 2.5 guys, because it didn't occur during their strenuous attainment period. So here's an ideological constraint. If you smoke a cigarette outside, it's okay. If you smoke a cigarette inside, it's harmful to everybody else. You can't do it. Today in Oregon right now, it's against the law to smoke a cigarette in your car with your 16-year-old or 17-year-old or 17-year-old and 11-month son, but he can smoke in the car with you, right? It's just a weird ideology. I'm not suggesting any of you go out and start smoking cigarettes, but what I want to show is there's a difference between science and fact and ideology. That's the key that I'm looking at. We'll see if this guy comes back. Forest management, the Berry Point fire was 93,000 acres of forest land that was destroyed because of poor timber management. There's no harvest available in our forest today because of issues with regard to environmental protectionism. We can allow it to burn, we can create smoke out of it, but don't dare build a home out of it, right? You cannot harvest it for usable lumber. You cannot harvest it for its timber resource, but you can allow it to burn and actually devastate the entire watershed in that forest area. So these things are ideological problems that we face. We all face them. You're all familiar with them. And I'm asking the question, what's the problem? And I'm pointing to the EPA building here in Washington, D.C.
That's the problem.
Yeah. Actually, the problem's bigger than that, because the
UN.
problem results from the government education model. The problem is a problem associated with the regulatory ideas that come from those models and the intervention that happens in the marketplace after all of those ideas come to fruition. Our government today, for example, here's an example. I was going to say our government today spends more money buying votes than they spend anywhere else. You can see that on this slide here. I created this chart last week. I painted the one line green. You can do this on Fred. It's the website for the Federal Reserve of St. Louis. You can create your own graphs and come up with all kinds of cool images. I thought this one did a good job of illustrating spending, which is the red line, and revenue coming into the federal government on the green line. And you'll notice they're way, way, way apart from each other. Where is all of that spending going? 80% of the ARRA money, ARRA, that's the Americans Reinvestment and Renewal Act. Are you familiar with that? 80% of that funding went to counties, municipalities, cities, and states. In other words, they have been paying close attention to leaders and men and women in government to keep them lined up like good little goose, ducklings, goslings in the chain of events. You know where your food comes from, you follow along, right? These are ideas that you can't help but recognize when you see this. One of the biggest problems with the government education monopoly is this. These are real dollars from 2008. So this chart goes all the way back to 1970 using real dollars calculated as of 2008. So this is the spending graph. You see the dollar figure on the right hand is NEPA test scores. On the left hand side is the amount of spending per student. So today in Klamath County, we're actually at $10,656 per student. Can any of you imagine spending $10,600 to teach your 5-year-old her primary colors? Okay, and next year you're going to do the same, $10,600 to teach your now first grader how to count to 10. Can anybody imagine how that happens? And the shameful thing is, look at the bottom here, these red and green bars running across are, let's see, the math score is green, reading score in red. Tell me if you notice a significant change in math scores or a significant change in reading scores, while at the same time answer the question, do you notice a significant change in the amount of money spent to accomplish the same thing? This is a Cato report. You can get it online, and I recommend you read the article. It's a fantastic article. I can point you to it as well. This is another chart that shows really the same data. It's just a different look at it. This is a percent of the government's influence in the GDP. The government in 1873, which was quite a while ago, was only 10%. It's actually at 12% in this graph. We don't have a whole lot of detail, but at 12% in this graph, that was the percent of GDP in Western countries. So basically all of the industrial countries, just after, 100 years after our nation's founding, 25 years after the Civil War, this is the size of government. Over here on your far right is a percent of GDP of Western governments today. So can anybody say Cyprus, right? Can anybody say Greece? Can anybody say, gee, what's up for the United States of America? Remember, our outlay is coming in at a much higher number than our income. We are expending enormous resources, and all the while we're expending enormous resources, not only are we trying to create taxing districts and bond measures, but we're also creating an enormous volume of regulations that the average man and woman has to comply with. Any of you who flushed a toilet today, that was an approved toilet. It was no doubt a low-flow toilet, and you had to go at it a couple of times, but nevertheless, that's what an approved toilet works like because the government says so. If you plugged in your coffee pot, that also had, approval stamps on it. In fact, the electrical outlet passed through the inspector's nose, and he okayed everything as well as the plans for your home, etc. And the blanket you were sleeping on last night also has a little warning label on it that says that this too has passed under all of the appropriate rules and regulations. This is the volume of pages that are getting added to the Federal Register on a yearly basis. That means if I could show you the cumulative chart, the end chart at the way out here would be all of those numbers added together, all of those years, and it would poke through the roof of this building. This is a burden that each one of you pays because of this ideology. So there are really three things that you see going on here. These are three things that every one of you can get involved in. These are three things that affect the people in Klamath County, the people in Jackson County. They're the three things that also affect every single person in the United States of America. Right now, schools are being reoriented from a historical perspective of what really occurred and how it occurred and why it occurred, and understanding the past, to a reform perspective about how glorious the future will be. Thanks anyway, but I think that's what Sunday morning is designed for. I'll hear about the glories of the future coming from the pulpit, and I would really like my math teacher to give me the facts about why 1 plus 3 is 4, and by golly, 2 plus 2 is also 4. I want an explanation of the real world, because quite frankly, that's where we live. If you think about this, if I'm not explaining the past or the facts or real events, and I'm not encapsulating them within the American tradition that you and I know, where are these ideas going to if I'm reorienting towards the future? My reorientation is really, quite frankly, imagination, right? None of you have a crystal ball. I don't have a crystal ball. How are we getting out there if we don't know, other than it's an ideological perspective? This is, if it's trying to change the way the past really was, then what it really is propaganda trying to twist what was in the past. If it's describing how glorious the future can be, it's somebody's imagination, but none of us are paying attention to the facts as they exist on the table. And I think this is an important facet to recognize. The next item is the centralization of control. This is where Common Core comes into play. Common Core is the complete centralization of and control. You will no longer have control over your local school district because Washington will. And Washington will allocate money. Remember, they're printing money. They've got it. They can allocate it. They can buy whoever they want to buy. And at this point in time, it's in our best interest to prevent things like centralized control, because that means we lose it. You lose the ability to choose the textbooks for your school, for your child's classroom, and you lose the ability there. Actually, what I recommend is putting your children, asking your children to put your grandchildren in private school. I recommend asking your children to seriously consider homeschooling their children. Tell them you're willing as a grandparent to help them by investing in their grandchildren. This is another item I forgot to mention when I introduced myself. Diane and I, not only have we been off the grid for 18 years, but we homeschooled our children. And quite frankly, I'm proud of that. It has worked out beautifully. They went to college with scholarships. Why? Because their SAT tests were out of this world. It's easy to compete if you score within the realm of what's expected, and it doesn't have to be marching to this ideological tune, because if you march to the ideological tune, you will get absorbed. So it's a really interesting thing. The last item here is the undermining of education as we see it today is happening at a universal level. Sustainable health, wellness, all of these ideas are all being talked about. If you'll recall, the very first slide I said I had up here was a slide that was talking about how interesting a tyrant has the ability to subvert the true meaning of the words that he's using. So this is where we sit today. We're all facing this, and this has been around for a long time. This is a long quote. 1942. World government is the ultimate aim. And it must be recognized that laws of nations, that the law of nations takes precedent over national law. Now, here's what's interesting. Laws of nations, help me to define that for me. Who can define that? Again, this is an ideology. National laws become irrelevant. It's the law of nations, and put your hand on that. What does that look like? How big is it? How many holes does it have in it? How solid is it? What's it formed of? You have no idea. This is an ideology. Then I think this second paragraph, this is from P.E. Corbett. It says, the process will have to be assisted by the deletion of the nationalistic material employed in educational textbooks. Its replacement material will talk about the benefits of a wiser association. Recognize this as the modern collectivist mind. Collectivism is here, and it is an ideology that each one of us should consider at every turn. The ideology is particularly stunning because Aldous Huxley wrote this in A Brave New World, and this is quite the powerful quote. My little remote is too small to read. Let me turn my head. A really efficient totalitarian state would be one which the all-powerful executive of political bosses and his army of managers, who said EPA earlier, control a population of slaves who do not have to be coerced because they love their servitude. The sentence continues on. To make them love it is the task assigned to the present-day totalitarian states, to the ministries of propaganda, newspaper editors, and school teachers. This kind of information is powerful information. I hope you saw the year that was written. This has been happening for our entire lives. And we have several things that we need to do. I think the most important thing that you can do is avoid getting tangled up in road closure in the Galice mining issue. I'm not saying these aren't important. I'm just mentioning them just so you see them. Total maximum daily load coming out of your rivers and sewers, PM 2.5 air quality, forest fires and suppression costs, sustainable timber and harvest, EPA noxious gas, CO2 greenhouse. You see, all of these little items are all part of a giant lid that's being screwed down on the American Republic. And the American Republic turns out to be in a closing coffin, and they're nailing it shut if we don't find men and women who can tear the lid off. So the men and women who can tear the lid off, quite frankly, are at the federal level. I'm just a county commissioner. Wyden and Merkley and Walden, those would be our two senators and representative who are right here over our county. Those men have to be held accountable. If those men aren't held accountable, how tight will this go before we finally choke the life out of our economy? It's an interesting concept. I can give you material to read or point you to information. I think it's paramount that you think deeply about how to influence your children for your grandchildren's sake. If you know of people who are in the educational arena, you can thank them for doing a good job, but recognize they may not be part of the problem, but they're another nail in the coffin, because centralized control is managing this for them. They don't get an independent word. They don't get an independent thought. They barely get to control their own classroom without the local cop saying, "Hey, that Pop-Tart looks like a pistol," right? You've heard that, right?
Yeah.
You know, these things, you have to laugh. It's got to be a fun night to be out and be around. What else are we going to do?